A surgeon's hands trembled over two beating hearts. Dr. Samuel Carter stood between wealth and worth, forced to decide which life the world deemed worthy of tomorrow. The hospital demanded he save the billionaire. His conscience whispered the janitor's name. In Atlanta's most prestigious medical center, power and money pressed against his shoulders like stone, but memory pulled at his chest. 40 years of Harold's gentle questions, his dignity offered freely to everyone. One choice would cost everything. One choice would save his soul. This is the story of the decision that destroyed a career, but delivered a man from the corruption of counting lives in dollars. Subscribe to witness the moment when humanity stood against the machine. Dr. Samuel Carter had spent 37 years learning to read the language of dying hearts, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the particular silence that filled the operating room's anteroom that November afternoon when two names appeared on the emergency board at exactly the same moment, both marked critical, both requiring immediate intervention, both carrying the red designation that meant minutes mattered more than procedure. The fluorescent lights hummed above him with their usual indifference as he stood before the board, his surgical scrubs already tied, his hands already scrubbed clean, his mind already calculating odds and outcomes the way it had done thousands of times before. But this time the calculations refused to resolve into clarity because the numbers kept transforming into faces, into voices, into the weight of years and the texture of human connection. He could feel the presence of the hospital administrator behind him, could sense the board members gathering like shadows in the corridor, could hear the rustle of expensive suits and the clearing of throats that carried the sound of money and expectation, and he knew without turning around that they had already decided which name should live and which should become a regrettable statistic in the quiet records that hospitals keep but never speak about in their glossy brochures or their fundraising galas. The first name on the board belonged to Mr. Harrison Sterling, 55 years old, venture capitalist, philanthropist, the man whose name appeared on the hospital's new research wing in letters tall enough to be seen from the interstate, the man whose foundation had funded the very equipment that Dr. Carter would use to perform whichever surgery he chose, the man whose lawyers were probably already positioning themselves in the waiting room, like well-dressed sentinels, guarding not just a life, but an investment, a legacy, a structure of power that extended far beyond the walls of this building, into boardrooms and political offices, and the invisible networks where decisions about funding and policy and the future of institutions like this one were made over drinks and handshakes. Sterling had arrived by private helicopter 40 minutes earlier, his chest pains severe enough to bypass every protocol and land him directly in the cardiac unit, his entourage filling the hallways with the particular energy that wealth brings to medical emergencies, the assumption of priority, the unspoken certainty that money can purchase not just the best care, but the first care, the only care if circumstances demanded such cruel mathematics. Dr. Carter had met Sterling twice before, at hospital functions, had shaken his hand across tables laden with catered food and crystal glasses, had listened to speeches about innovation and excellence and the partnership between private generosity and public health, had smiled politely while feeling the particular discomfort that always came when medicine was discussed in the language of investment returns and tax benefits. The second name belonged to Harold Jennings, 62 years old, janitor, the man who had mopped these same floors for 4 decades, who knew every doctor by name and every nurse by their coffee preference, who had quietly witnessed births and ends and miracles and failures with the same gentle presence that Dr. Carter had come to recognize as a kind of wisdom that had nothing to do with degrees or credentials, but everything to do with seeing people as people regardless of their titles or their bank accounts. Harold had collapsed in the basement storage room while restocking supplies, had been found by a new nurse who almost didn't recognize the emergency because Harold's first words upon regaining consciousness were apologies for the mess, for the inconvenience, for taking up space in a hospital where he had always understood himself to be part of the infrastructure rather than someone who deserved to be cared for within it. Dr. Carter had known Harold since his first week at the hospital, had been welcomed with a warmth that made the sterile corridors feel less lonely, had received advice about which vending machines worked best and which stairwells stayed warmest in winter, and where to find quiet when the weight of other people's suffering became too heavy to carry in the bright public spaces where doctors were expected to project confidence and control. The medical facts were brutally simple and offered no escape through technical complexity or procedural ambiguity. Both men were experiencing severe cardiac events that required immediate surgical intervention. Both had conditions that demanded the same specialized procedure that Dr. Carter had performed hundreds of times. Both were stable enough to survive the next 20 minutes, but would likely not survive the next 40 without intervention. And the hospital had only one operating theatre available and only one surgical team capable of performing the procedure with the speed and precision that these circumstances demanded. Dr. Carter's hands had steadied thousands of scalpels, had sutured thousands of arteries, had restarted thousands of hearts that had forgotten how to beat on their own. But those hands felt suddenly foreign to him now, felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone who existed in a simpler world, where medical decisions were made based on urgency and severity, rather than on the invisible calculations of worth that were currently being performed in the minds of the administrators who had not yet spoken, but whose presence behind him felt like a jury waiting for a verdict. He had always believed that medicine existed outside of these considerations, that the emergency room was the one place in American society where the fiction of equality became temporary truth, where the heart attack of a homeless man received the same urgent response as the heart attack of a senator. But he was learning in this moment that such beliefs were luxuries, maintained only when the mathematics of scarcity did not force the abstraction into concrete choice. Dr. Carter turned slowly from the board to face the small crowd that had gathered in the corridor, and he recognized in their faces the particular tension that comes when people are about to ask someone else to bear the weight of a decision they are grateful not to have to make themselves. And he saw Dr. Patricia Morrison, the hospital administrator, step forward with the expression of someone who has rehearsed this conversation, who has consulted with lawyers and board members and perhaps even crisis management consultants about how to phrase what needed to be said without saying it too directly, without creating the kind of explicit record that could be subpoenaed or quoted, or turned into the kind of public relations disaster that modern institutions fear more than they fear most forms of actual wrongdoing. She spoke in the measured tones of someone translating institutional pressure into the language of medical necessity, reminding Dr. Carter of Mr. Sterling's significance to the hospital's mission, of the research that his donations had funded, of the lives that had been saved because of his generosity, of the future possibilities that depended on maintaining relationships with benefactors who believed in the hospital's vision. And though she never said the words directly, though she wrapped everything in the careful phrasing of suggestion rather than command, Dr. Carter understood perfectly that he was being told to save the billionaire and let the janitor become a tragic but ultimately acceptable loss that could be mourned quietly and forgotten quickly. The silence that followed Dr. Morrison's careful speech felt like it had physical weight, like the air itself had become denser, harder to breathe, and Dr. Carter found himself thinking about all the small moments that had accumulated over 40 years between himself and Harold, the morning greetings that had become ritual, the conversations about grandchildren and garden vegetables, and the small victories that made up a life, the way Harold had noticed when Dr. Carter's wife had left him 7 years ago and had simply started bringing an extra coffee some mornings without asking questions or offering unwanted advice. Just the quiet acknowledgement that loneliness was real and that small kindnesses could build bridges across it. He thought about how Harold had treated every person in this building with the same careful dignity. How he had learned everyone's names when most people never bothered to learn his. How he had maintained his gentle humor even when he was invisible to those who considered themselves too important to notice the man who kept their workspace clean and functional. Dr. Carter realized that he knew Harold in a way he had never known Mr. Sterling. That 40 years of accumulated small interactions had built something that resembled not just familiarity, but actual relationship. And he understood suddenly that this decision was not really about medical ethics or institutional loyalty, but about which story of human value he was willing to stake his life on, the story that money and power told about who mattered most, or the story that his own lived experience whispered was true. Dr. Carter heard his own voice before he fully understood that he had made a decision, heard himself say Harold's name with a clarity that surprised him, watched the faces in the corridor shift from expectant to confused to something harder to name, something that looked like anger wrapped in the professional mask that hospital administrators wore when subordinates failed to understand their proper role in the institutional hierarchy. Dr. Morrison's expression froze in that particular way that faces do when the script has been violated, when the expected response has been replaced with something that requires immediate recalculation, and Dr. Carter saw her glance toward the board members who stood further back in the corridor like witnesses to a betrayal they had not anticipated, but would certainly remember. The moment stretched and compressed simultaneously, feeling both eternal and instantaneous. And Dr. Carter recognized this as the sensation that came with crossing thresholds that could not be uncrossed, with speaking truths that could not be unspoken, with choosing directions that would reshape the entire landscape of what came after. He turned away before anyone could respond, before the arguments could begin, before the pressure could mount in ways that might cause him to doubt what his conscience had already declared. And he walked toward the operating room with the steady gait of someone who had stopped calculating odds and started trusting something deeper than strategy. The surgical team assembled around him with the practiced efficiency of people who had worked together through countless emergencies, who communicated in glances and gestures that carried more meaning than full sentences, who understood that once a surgeon committed to a course of action, the only response was precision and speed, regardless of any confusion about why this patient, rather than that patient, was being wheeled through the doors. Dr. Carter could feel questions hovering in the room like smoke, could sense the nurses and anesthesiologist trying to reconcile what they knew about hospital politics with what they were witnessing. But the protocols of the operating theater created a kind of sacred space where external considerations were supposed to fall away, where the only thing that mattered was the body on the table and the problem that needed solving and the steady accumulation of correct decisions that separated survival from its opposite. Harold lay unconscious on the table, his face slack in the way that anesthesia creates, stripped of the gentle animation that Dr. Carter associated with him, reduced to the vulnerability that medicine both required and protected. And looking at that vulnerable face, Dr. Carter felt the rightness of his choice settle into his bones, like something that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. The surgery proceeded with the methodical rhythm that Dr. Carter had learned to inhabit, the state where time became elastic and the boundaries between self and task dissolved into something like meditation, where his hands seemed to know what to do before his conscious mind issued instructions, where decades of training transformed into instinct that moved through muscle memory and pattern recognition, and the accumulated wisdom of having solved this particular problem hundreds of times before. He worked through the careful architecture of Harold's heart, identifying the blockages and rerouting blood flow and rebuilding the damaged tissue with the patience that this work demanded, occasionally aware of the larger hospital moving outside this room, of conversations being had and decisions being made and institutional machinery beginning to turn in response to his choice, but keeping his focus narrowed to the immediate task, because that focus was the only thing standing between Harold and the end that everyone outside this room had apparently accepted as inevitable. The monitors beeped their steady reassurance, the numbers holding stable in ranges that promised continuation, and Dr. Carter found himself praying without words to something he was not sure he believed in, asking for this life to hold, for this choice to be vindicated not through argument or principle, but through the simple fact of Harold waking up and returning to the world that needed him, even if it had not known how much, until this moment. 3 hours passed in what felt like both minutes and days. That strange compression and expansion that happened in operating rooms where clock time became irrelevant, and the only measure that mattered was the steady progress toward completion, toward the moment when the problem was solved or acknowledged as unsolvable, when the patient either stabilized or declined beyond recovery. Carter closed the final incision with stitches so precise they looked like artwork, like the kind of careful attention that came not from obligation, but from something closer to love, from the recognition that this body belonged to someone who had mattered to him in ways that had nothing to do with medicine or professional responsibility. He stepped back from the table and felt exhaustion roll through him like a wave, felt the accumulated tension of the past hours release all at once, and he nodded to the team who began the process of preparing Harold for recovery, of transferring him from this liminal space between life and its absence to the rooms where healing happened slowly and required patience and the willingness to believe that tomorrow might arrive despite everything. Dr. Carter stripped off his surgical gloves with movements that felt heavy, waited with the knowledge that he would have to leave this room and face whatever waited outside, that his work here was finished, but his reckoning with the consequences had barely begun. The corridor outside the operating theater felt colder than Dr. Carter remembered, felt like crossing from one country into another where different laws applied and different values governed behavior, and he was not surprised to see Dr. Morrison waiting with 2 members of the hospital board, their faces arranged in expressions that managed to combine disappointment and professional distance in equal measure. They did not speak immediately, did not need to, because the silence itself was a statement, a declaration that boundaries had been crossed and prices would be extracted, and Dr. Carter found himself thinking about how institutions protected themselves not through confrontation, but through the slow accumulation of consequences, through the ways that careers could be ended without anyone ever having to issue direct threats or make explicit accusations. Dr. Morrison spoke first, her voice carrying none of the careful courtesy from earlier, stripped now of pretense and reduced to the bare language of institutional discipline, informing Dr. Carter that Mr. Sterling's family was threatening legal action, that the board was questioning his judgment and fitness to make critical decisions under pressure, that his actions had created complications that extended far beyond this single surgery, into realms of liability and donor relations and public perception that would take months to untangle. She did not say that he was fired, not yet, because institutions moved slowly, even in anger, but Dr. Carter understood that his time at this hospital was finished, that the machinery had started turning and would not stop until he was removed from the building and replaced with someone who understood their proper role in the hierarchy of human value that money created and sustained. Dr. Carter listened without defending himself, without offering the explanations or justifications that might have bought him time or softened the institutional response, because he recognized that anything he said would be translated into the language of insubordination or poor judgment, or whatever categories the hospital needed to construct its narrative about what had happened and why. He thought about Mr. Sterling, wondered if the man had survived whatever procedure another surgeon had performed in his place, realized with some surprise that he did not feel guilt about that outcome regardless of what it had been, felt instead a strange clarity about the impossibility of playing the mathematics game that institutions wanted to play with human lives. The game where some deaths were acceptable losses and others were institutional failures, where value was calculated in donation amounts rather than in the accumulated weight of small kindnesses and steady presence. He excused himself from the conversation that was becoming less conversation and more formal notification, walked through the corridors that he had walked for decades, corridors that suddenly felt unfamiliar despite their familiarity, and he made his way toward the recovery wing, where Harold would be waking soon into a world that had chosen him despite every structural force that had argued for his expendability. The morning after the surgery arrived with the particular brightness that November sometimes achieves when cold fronts push through Georgia, clearing the humidity and leaving behind air so sharp it felt like it might cut skin, and Dr. Carter stood in his small office, soon-to-be former office, packing books and framed degrees and the accumulated artifacts of a career that had just ended before breakfast. His hands moved automatically through the familiar objects while his mind circled the strange territory of unemployment, of professional exile, of the peculiar freedom that came with having made an unforgivable choice and having to live with whatever that unforgivability meant in practical terms like mortgage payments and health insurance and the daily rhythms that gave structure to existence. He had received the formal termination notice by email at 6 in the morning, delivered with the cowardice that modern institutions preferred, words on a screen that translated decades of service into liability and risk management, and the careful legal language that protected everyone except the person being discarded. The hospital's statement had already appeared in the morning news, had already begun shaping the narrative around his decision into a story about recklessness and poor judgment and the tragic but necessary consequences when individual doctors prioritized personal feelings over institutional protocols. And Dr. Carter had read these descriptions of himself, descriptions written by people who had never performed surgery, who had never held a failing heart in their hands, who had never had to choose between two lives while knowing that either choice would haunt them forever, with a detachment that surprised him, as if they were discussing someone else entirely, some fictional character whose mistakes served as cautionary tale for others who might consider similar rebellions against the natural order of things. The hospital's legal team had already contacted him about settling Mr. Sterling's family lawsuit before it could proceed to court, had offered him the opportunity to issue a public apology and accept responsibility for what they termed a catastrophic error in judgment, had made clear that his cooperation in this narrative construction would determine how aggressively they fought to protect his medical license and his ability to practice anywhere else. Dr. Carter had listened to their proposals with the strange calm that came from having already lost everything that institutional power could threaten, from understanding that his reputation was already being dismantled in conference rooms and legal briefings and the invisible networks where doctors' careers were evaluated and futures decided. He had declined their offers, had refused to apologize for choosing Harold's life over Mr. Sterling's money, had accepted that this refusal would cost him whatever protections the institution might have provided, and he found himself wondering if courage was supposed to feel this much like exhaustion, if standing on principle was supposed to leave you this empty and uncertain about what came next. The silence in his office felt absolute, despite the usual hospital sounds filtering through the walls, the pages and codes and rolling equipment that created the constant background noise of institutional healthcare. Because those sounds belonged now to a world he was leaving, a world that would continue without him, as if he had never existed within it, as if 37 years of service could be erased as easily as a name removed from a door. Harold had regained consciousness late the previous evening, had opened his eyes in the recovery room, surrounded by machines and monitors, and the particular antiseptic smell that marked these transition spaces between crisis and healing. And Dr. Carter had been there, despite the hospital's clear preference that he maintain distance from the patient whose life he had chosen, and the consequences that choice had created. Harold's first words had been questions about whether he was causing trouble, whether his presence in the recovery room was taking space from someone who needed it more, whether Dr. Carter was okay, because Harold could see something in his expression that spoke of costs beyond what anyone should pay for simply doing their job. Dr. Carter had found himself crying then, not dramatically but quietly, tears that felt like they carried years of accumulated pressure from trying to reconcile the ideals that had brought him to medicine with the realities of how medicine functioned within systems designed to protect power and wealth rather than to distribute care according to need. Harold had reached out with a hand still connected to IV lines and monitors, had gripped Dr. Carter's hand with surprising strength for someone who had been hours from the end less than a day before, had said simply that he understood what the choice had cost and that he was grateful and sorry in equal measure. Grateful for life and sorry for the price that life had extracted from someone else. The days that followed Dr. Carter's termination moved with the strange slowness that unemployment brings to people whose identities have been built entirely around their work, whose sense of purpose has been so thoroughly merged with professional role that removal from that role feels like dissolution of self rather than simply change of circumstance. He found himself waking at the same early hour his surgical schedule had demanded, found his body preparing for routines that no longer existed, found his mind rehearsing procedures and reviewing patient cases that were no longer his responsibility or concern. The local medical community responded to his firing with the careful silence that professionals maintain when one of their own has been marked as trouble, when standing too close to controversy might draw unwanted attention or suggest alignment with choices that institutions had already declared unacceptable. Former colleagues who had been friends stopped returning calls. Conferences that had invited him to speak suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts. The network that had supported his career for decades quietly erased him from their considerations and calculations with the efficiency that social structures bring to the task of maintaining boundaries and punishing deviation. Dr. Carter understood that he was being taught a lesson, that his exile served as warning to others who might consider similar rebellions against the hierarchies that determined whose life mattered most when resources were scarce and choices had to be made. The lawsuit from Mr. Sterling's family proceeded with the relentless momentum that money could purchase, with lawyers who specialized in medical malpractice building their case around the narrative that Dr. Carter had allowed personal bias and emotional attachment to override professional judgment, that his choice represented not principle, but failure, not courage, but incompetence, not ethics, but the kind of sentimentality that good doctors learn to suppress in favor of rational calculation about outcomes and institutional responsibilities. They presented expert witnesses who testified about protocols and best practices and the ways that Dr. Carter's decision violated standards of care. Though these experts carefully avoided discussing the fact that no standard protocol existed for choosing between two equally urgent patients when only one could be saved, that the real protocol in such situations was the unspoken understanding that institutional power determined priority, and doctors who violated that understanding faced exactly the consequences that Dr. Carter was now experiencing. The deposition process felt like surgery performed without anesthesia, like being opened up and examined by people who were looking for evidence of malice or negligence or whatever story would serve their clients' interests. And Dr. Carter answered their questions with the same steady honesty that had characterized his entire career, refusing to perform the theater of regret or uncertainty that might have softened their case, maintaining simply that he had made the only choice his conscience allowed and would make the same choice again, regardless of consequences. Harold visited Dr. Carter's apartment 3 weeks after the surgery, arrived unannounced with a container of soup made by his wife and the kind of gentle concern that had always characterized their interactions. And they sat in Dr. Carter's living room while afternoon light filtered through windows that faced a parking lot and a future that felt uncertain in ways that both terrified and strangely liberated. Harold spoke about the other janitors at the hospital, about how they had started wearing small pins that said Harold's team, in quiet solidarity with the man whose life had been deemed worth saving despite institutional preferences. About how this small rebellion had spread to some nurses and even a few doctors who understood that something important had happened in that moment of choice, even if they could not say so publicly without risking their own positions. He told Dr. Carter that he had become a symbol of something he never intended to symbolize, that his survival carried meanings about value and dignity and the relationship between money and human worth that extended far beyond his individual story, and he seemed both honored and uncomfortable with this symbolic weight, with being transformed from person into principle, from Harold who mopped floors into Harold who represented everyone who had ever been invisible to power. Dr. Carter listened and understood that his choice had created ripples that neither of them controlled, that actions taken in moments of moral clarity could not be contained or managed once they entered the larger world where people were hungry for stories that challenged the structures that oppressed them. The medical board hearing arrived 6 months after the surgery, held in a conference room that felt designed to intimidate with its long table and uncomfortable chairs, and walls lined with framed regulations that documented the elaborate architecture of professional accountability. And Dr. Carter sat across from a panel of doctors and administrators who would decide whether his license to practice medicine would be revoked or merely suspended, whether his career was completely finished or simply paused in some liminal state that might eventually allow for restoration if he demonstrated sufficient contrition and understanding of his errors. The hearing proceeded with the formal choreography of institutional judgment, with presentations of evidence and testimony from expert witnesses and careful passing of regulations and standards of care that attempted to transform his choice into a violation of objective professional criteria rather than a conflict between different visions of what medicine should value and protect. Dr. Carter's lawyer had advised him to express remorse, to acknowledge that emotion had clouded his judgment, to present himself as someone who had learned from his mistake and could be trusted to make better decisions in the future. But Dr. Carter found himself unable to perform this script, unable to describe saving Harold's life as a mistake, unable to pretend that he regretted choosing conscience over institutional pressure, even if that choice had cost him everything he had spent decades building. Mr. Sterling had not survived his cardiac event, had deteriorated while waiting for surgical intervention, and had passed away, despite the best efforts of the surgeon who had finally operated on him after Dr. Carter had committed to Harold's procedure, and his death had become the centerpiece of the narrative that the hospital and the Sterling family's lawyers were constructing about the cost of Dr. Carter's choice. They presented charts and statistics about survival rates and optimal intervention windows, argued that Mr. Sterling's life could have been saved if Dr. Carter had made the correct choice, transformed his death into evidence of professional negligence rather than the tragic outcome of an impossible situation where someone was always going to die regardless of which path the surgeon chose. Dr. Carter listened to these arguments and recognized them as necessary fictions, as the stories that institutions told themselves to avoid confronting the uncomfortable truth that medicine operated within systems of scarcity and inequality that regularly produced exactly these kinds of impossible choices. That the real scandal was not his decision, but the structures that created situations where doctors had to choose between lives because resources were distributed according to ability to pay rather than according to need. The panel members asked him questions designed to elicit admission of error, to get him to acknowledge that institutional protocols existed for good reasons, and that individual doctors could not simply override those protocols based on personal feelings. And Dr. Carter answered by asking them which of their loved ones they would choose to die if faced with the same impossible math, which life they would declare less valuable if the choice fell to them rather than to someone else. Harold attended the hearing, though no one had asked him to come, sat in the small gallery section with other janitors from the hospital who had taken vacation days to be present, their uniforms replaced with the uncomfortable dress clothes that working people wore when they needed to signal respect for institutional proceedings that rarely showed them any respect in return. Their presence created a tension in the room that no one acknowledged directly, but that everyone could feel, the unspoken reminder that Dr. Carter's choice had not been abstract, that real lives and real people were involved in these supposedly objective deliberations about professional standards and appropriate conduct. When the panel chair asked Dr. Carter directly if he maintained that his choice had been correct, despite the outcome for Mr. Sterling, despite the disruption to institutional functioning, despite the lawsuits and bad publicity and the damage to the hospital's relationship with its major donors, Dr. Carter looked not at the panel, but at Harold sitting in the gallery, at this man whose steady presence had enriched decades of his professional life with a kind of human connection that had nothing to do with status or credentials, and he said yes, he maintained his choice was correct, would make it again, would always choose the person he knew and valued over the person whose money created obligation but not relationship, would always choose dignity over power when forced to choose at all. The panel deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their decision to permanently revoke Dr. Carter's medical license, to remove him from the profession he had served for nearly 4 decades, to declare him unfit to practice medicine because he had demonstrated an inability to separate personal feelings from professional judgment, because he had violated the trust that institutions placed in doctors to make decisions that served larger organizational interests rather than individual conscience. The decision was delivered in the flat bureaucratic language that institutions used to disguise cruelty as necessity, framed as the unfortunate but inevitable consequence of Dr. Carter's unwillingness to acknowledge his error and demonstrate that he could be trusted to make better choices in the future. Dr. Carter listened to the verdict and felt something release inside him, felt the last connection to his old life sever cleanly, and he recognized that he was entering territory that he had never imagined having to navigate, that he would have to discover who he was when stripped of the identity that had defined him since medical school, when reduced to just Samuel Carter without the doctor title that had preceded his name for so long that he had almost forgotten it was a title rather than an essential part of his being. He stood and thanked the panel with genuine gratitude that surprised them. Thanked them for releasing him from the exhausting work of pretending that he could continue to function within systems that required him to calculate human value in ways that violated everything he actually believed about human dignity and worth. The months that followed the hearing unfolded with the strange rhythm of rebuilding, of discovering that life continued, even when the structures that had organized it for decades collapsed and left only rubble and possibility. Dr. Carter found work at a free clinic in a neighborhood that the city had written off, where patients arrived with problems that had been ignored until they became crises, where insurance status and ability to pay never determined who received care because the clinic operated on the radical principle that health care was a right rather than a commodity to be distributed according to market logic. He worked alongside nurse practitioners and social workers and community health workers who had chosen this work not because it paid well or advanced careers, but because they believed in serving people who had been abandoned by every other institution. And he found in this work a kind of purpose that his hospital career had never quite provided, found that treating people as people rather than as cases or revenue streams or potential donors created relationships that felt more real than anything he had experienced in the prestigious medical center where his previous identity had been built. The pay was minimal, barely enough to cover his modest needs, but the work itself felt clean in ways that his old career had not. Felt like medicine practiced according to principles rather than according to institutional survival strategies. Felt like using his skills in alignment with his values rather than in spite of them. Harold visited regularly, had become something more than a former colleague, had transformed into a friend, in the truest sense, someone whose presence reminded Dr. Carter that his choice had mattered, not because of what it cost him, but because of what it said about refusing to accept the logic that reduced human beings to calculations of relative worth. They rarely discussed the surgery or the hearing or the consequences that continued to ripple through both their lives, talked instead about small things and large things, about grandchildren and politics and the weather, and the ways that ordinary people built meaning in a world that seemed designed to crush meaning under the weight of systems too large to comprehend or resist. Harold brought news from the hospital. Stories about small changes happening in the wake of Dr. Carter's firing, about ethics committees being formed to address impossible choices, about anonymous donations being set up to help staff members who faced medical emergencies, about conversations happening in break rooms and cafeterias, about whose lives mattered and who decided, and whether medicine could ever truly serve everyone equally within structures designed to protect wealth and power. These stories suggested that Dr. Carter's choice had planted seeds that were growing in ways he could not control or direct, that his individual act of conscience had given permission to others to question structures that had seemed unquestionable, and he found himself hoping that something larger might emerge from his small rebellion, even while doubting that any individual action could truly challenge systems so deeply embedded in how society organized itself around money and status. The end of Dr. Carter's story was not really an ending, but a continuation. A life reorganized around different priorities and different measures of success. An existence stripped of prestige, but infused with the particular peace that comes from living according to conscience rather than according to institutional demands. He woke each morning without regret, worked each day treating patients who could not pay him, returned each evening to his modest apartment knowing that he had done what he could with what he had. And he recognized that this simple alignment between belief and action was a privilege that many people never achieved, that most lives were lived in compromise between what conscience demanded and what survival required. On the anniversary of the surgery, Harold arrived at Dr. Carter's apartment with his wife and children and grandchildren, with people from the clinic and the old hospital, with janitors and nurses, and even a few doctors who had quietly stayed in touch despite the professional risks, and they gathered not to celebrate Dr. Carter's sacrifice or to mourn his lost career, but simply to acknowledge that his choice had affirmed something important about human dignity, about the possibility of refusing to participate in systems that demanded you calculate the value of human lives according to their bank accounts. Dr. Carter looked around the crowded room and understood that he had lost everything except what actually mattered, had traded status and security for relationships and integrity, and he found himself grateful for the impossible choice that had destroyed his old life and delivered him into this new one where worth was measured not in dollars or donations, but in the steady accumulation of small kindnesses and the refusal to pretend that some lives mattered more than others.